Before we get into the main practical sections of this course, let's first understand what a SOC is, the components that make up a SOC, as well as some important terminology that we should be familiar with. Now, I have a confession here, and it's that this section of the course is going to be a bit of a death by PowerPoint section, and I'm really sorry in advance, but trust me, every other section of this course is going to be hands-on and practical. It's just that it's really hard to present some of this stuff in a less theoretical way. But I promise you that this is the only section that is going to be very slide heavy like this. And trust me that this is going to lay a necessary foundation that we're going to build upon to grasp some of the hands-on topics. So within this section, we aim to gain a holistic understanding of security operations within organizations that you might find yourself in. So when we talk about the domain objectives for this section, we want to understand the core functions within a SOC, as well as the role that it plays within organizations. So we want to answer questions like, why do we have a SOC? And what is the business justification for maintaining a SOC from a resource or a financial aspect? We also want to explore the daily tasks and responsibilities of a SOC analyst. We want to understand what the day-to-day looks like in an average SOC. We also want to familiarize ourselves with different SOC models, roles, and organizational structures. So how is the team actually structured? And how do various roles and responsibilities disseminate amongst the team? We also want to learn several metrics that are used to evaluate the effectiveness of our security operations, right? So what does success look like for a SOC team? And how can areas of improvement be identified? We want to understand various tools that are used within the SOC for monitoring, detection, analysis, and response. And lastly, we want to identify and understand common cybersecurity threats faced by organizations, because of course, as our technology landscape grows, so does our attack surface, and we need to be able, as SOC analysts, to quickly identify common threats. So the first question we should probably ask is, what is a SOC? Well, a SOC is short for a Security Operations Center. And you're going to see many different definitions of SOCs out there. Some sources might define a SOC as the heartbeat of an organization's security posture. And some sources might describe it as the frontline defense against cyber attacks. And all of these are essentially true. And part of this reason, and something that's continually going to come up throughout the course, is that SOCs can vary greatly between organizations based on their size, or industry, or budget, or maturity level. But regardless of the terminology used, the core essence of a SOC remains the same. A Security Operations Center is a centralized unit within an organization that deals with security issues, incidents, and events. And this definition casts a wide net, and that's kind of purposeful, because SOCs serve many different areas of the business, which we're going to cover shortly. But the primary objective of a SOC is to minimize the impact of cyber attacks and protect sensitive data, and to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the organization's assets. And so, of course, a SOC is going to be staffed with a team, and that team is going to consist of security analysts, and engineers, and incident responders, and basically a number of people that collaborate together in order to monitor, detect, analyze, and respond to cybersecurity incidents in real time. So let's cover all these different stages in more detail. So the first step in any security operations is monitoring, and that involves continually observing the organization's networks and systems and digital assets for any signs of suspicious activity. And so we use things like our monitoring tools and technologies, like our SIMs, our Security Information and Event Management Systems, or our IDS or Intrusion Detection Systems. And we use these tools to provide real-time visibility into things like our network traffic or log data. For example, suppose a SOC team has deployed an endpoint detection and response solution like CrowdStrike Falcon to all of the company's servers and workstations, and we use it to track things like file access, or suspicious processes, or login attempts. And so once potential security incidents are identified through our monitoring, SOC analysts employ various detection techniques to confirm the actual presence of threats. So this might involve things like correlating multiple security events together and searching through our SIM to analyze patterns of behavior based on the logs or statistics or even threat intelligence feeds to identify known indicators of compromise or IOCs. So to continue our example, suppose an alert is triggered within our EDR software, signifying that an employee, Bob Jones, is attempting to access sensitive files outside of their normal working hours and location. So in that case, we're actually analyzing Bob Jones's behavior on his system, and we're noticing, hey, this is an anomaly, Bob Jones typically operates between 9 to 5, and in this case, it's 3 a.m. his time. Why is he trying to access files at this time? And so we're going to get an alert on that. We're going to detect the event. And so here we move on to the analysis section. This is where analysts conduct in-depth investigations to understand the nature and scope of the incident. So this will involve things like examining the affected system, or analyzing malware samples, or tracing an attacker's tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, to determine the extent of the compromise. So in the case of our EDR alert, an analyst would need to investigate the alert to get more information. They might have to review Bob Jones's access history, right? His recent logins, the IP addresses of these logins to see if there's anything anomalous. We might need to look at other data points that we have available to us to determine if that access attempt is malicious. And next we have response, right? So based on our findings, SOC analysts need to formulate and execute a response plan to contain the threat or mitigate its impact and restore normal operations. So this might involve things like isolating the affected system, or deploying patches or updates, or coordinating with other internal teams like stakeholders or even law enforcement or regulatory bodies as needed. So to wrap up our EDR alert example, maybe after thorough investigation, we as an analyst find that Bob Jones's access attempt is in fact malicious. In which case we need to respond and mitigate the threat and contain the threat and do things like revoke Bob Jones's access. We would need to reset his credentials and maybe look through our SIM to see if we can correlate other events and try to figure out the root cause. We might need to inform relevant stakeholders and conduct a deeper investigation. And lastly, you can see here on the right how this all sort of works together and feeds into each other within this life cycle. So as we're able to improve our monitoring, we can then detect more incidents. And as we analyze these incidents, we're able to have more effective response. And through everything we've learned through our response and all of the indicators that we've collected, we can then feed that back into our monitoring to enhance our detection capabilities. So you can see how this all sort of feeds into each other and they all build upon each other. So when we say that a SOC is centralized, you might be picturing in your head something like the image on the screen here, where we have a giant bustling room filled with rows and desks, and a bunch of analysts sitting shoulder to shoulder, and hundreds of monitors at the front all displaying intricate graphs and charts. And, an image like this has long been the common depiction of a SOC in many people's minds. However, as the modern SOC has evolved, especially in the wake of things like the rise of remote work and the digital transformation of businesses, well, this sentiment is no longer as common. Instead, the concept of a centralized SOC has kind of undergone a transformation. So rather than a physical room housing a large team of analysts, today's SOC is increasingly virtualized and distributed in many cases. And with the advancement of cloud technologies and things like virtual private networks and collaboration platforms, well, now SOC teams are able to operate from almost anywhere in the world without the need for a centralized physical location. However, the SOC still logically refers to that centralized team within the organization. And we can also take a step back in time and understand how the concept of a SOC has evolved over time. And maybe in doing so, we can better understand how the priorities and the functions within a SOC have shifted to meet the changing landscape of threats and challenges. But at a high level, we've essentially seen changes from a primary focus on just availability monitoring to more reactive monitoring. And from there, we've moved on to proactive monitoring and now to proactive automation. And so the initial concept of a SOC started well before the 2000s and traces back to the early days of network security, primarily with government and defense organizations. In fact, we can go all the way back to 1975 with the United States National Security Operations Center. And this picture is so cool because it laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the modern SOC. Because back then, every security solution and control and tool was custom built to detect very specific threats. And most commonly back then, we're dealing with availability issues and malicious code running within a network. But during the late 90s and early 2000s, cyber threats kind of evolved, and organizations began to recognize the importance of fortifying their digital perimeter. And the emphasis shifted from initial availability monitoring towards perimeter defense, with companies spending investments in technologies like firewalls and antivirus software and intrusion detection systems. But the focus was still largely reactive, and SOC teams were more so responding to incidents as they occurred. But of course, the landscape of cyber threats continued to evolve. And around 2007, we saw the rise of advanced persistent threats, or APTs, which kind of introduced a new breed of attacks that haven't previously been seen before that operated in this low and slow type of environment and evaded traditional security methods. And these types of attacks meant that an adversary could be in your network for months or even years without any detection. And they could quietly exfiltrate data or start laying the groundwork for more large or devastating breaches. And so this prompted a transition from reactive to proactive monitoring within SOC environments. And this is sometimes referred to as the age of the SIM, or the Security Information and Event Management Systems, which we'll get into much more detail later on. This shift in mindset laid the groundwork for what is today the modern SOC, which adopted more of a proactive stance towards cybersecurity. So rather than just reacting to incidents, SOC teams began to actively monitor for signs of potential threats and using things like threat hunting techniques to proactively hunt for evil. And there are several other generations of SOC history that we didn't get into, but I don't think it's that important. The main takeaway here is that there was a shift between reactive perimeter defense to proactive threat detection and response. And so what actually makes up a SOC? It's not just a magical entity or concept that CISOs love to brag about and vendors love to sell products to. There are actual tangible things that make up the team and its capabilities. So every SOC is equipped with personnel, with protocols, and technical resources that all work together to cover the functions that we've talked about earlier. And, we mentioned personnel and protocols and technical resources, but let's break that down a bit because they are essentially the definitive pillars that make up a SOC. And another way that we can think of this is through people, processes, and technology. So of course, we have people. These are the personnel within the SOC that form that human element or that backbone of operations. And often this human element is crucial in ensuring how effective a SOC can be. This personnel includes people like analysts and incident responders and engineers and threat hunters, who all work together to actually analyze, respond to, and resolve security incidents, or do things like build out detection capabilities or manage the team. We also have processes. So SOC teams also need to build out descriptive processes that streamline their operations and ensure consistency, efficiency, and agility to manage and respond to incidents. So you might have specific incident response playbooks or detection and response processes that the team can follow during the lifecycle of an incident or event. For example, when an alert is triggered, what predefined processes or procedures are in place to dictate how the SOC responds? What escalation paths are there? What investigation steps or mitigation measures can be taken? Of course, that's not an exhaustive list, but just understand that processes drive the way in which people within the SOC conduct their operations. Lastly, we have technology. And technology provides the tools and infrastructure necessary for the people within the SOC to do their jobs and follow processes. And of course, this is a non-exhaustive list again, but concepts that fall into the technology category can include things like our SIM platform, our IDS or IPS systems, our EDR solutions, our SOAR systems, vulnerability management tools, or even our threat intelligence platforms. And of course, we're going to cover these tools and more in much more detail in the following lessons. And we'll also get to directly configure and interact with several of these tools to gain that hands-on experience with them in the following domains. Now, I also want to quickly touch on the concept of the CIA triad and how security operations centers use this model as a fundamental principle that basically guide every single practice, decision, and control that they make. And more specifically, the SOC supports the business by upholding these principles of the CIA triad. So we have confidentiality, we have integrity, and availability. We're going to cover each of these in more detail in a future lesson, but at a high level, the SOC aims to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all assets within the organization. And we can think about how all of these concepts kind of intersect during an incident, right? So for example, in the case of a critical server failing, maybe we had a hardware disk failure in one of the servers and we did not have redundancy in place. Well, in this case, we'd be facing an availability issue because we are losing access to the data stored on that server. So in this case, the SOC would rely on the people, the experts that can leverage their expertise of skilled analysts and other IT personnel who understand the intricacies of the system. And these people would then enact pre-established recovery, redundancy, or failover processes to mitigate the impact of the availability issue. And lastly, they would utilize technology solutions like automated backup software or redundancy failover solutions that can restore and bring up the affected server. And lastly here, let's take a look at some of the key functions of a SOC, right? So we talked about what makes up the SOC and the value that they add to organizations, but what specific objectives do they actually serve on a day-to-day basis? Now, this won't be an exhaustive list, but it's going to highlight some of the high-level functions that a typical SOC will perform within an organization. And we can generally break down the key functions of a SOC into two distinct categories. We have reactive functions and proactive functions. So on the reactive side, these are functions that the SOC performs in response to cybersecurity incidents as they occur. So we have things like the primary role of the SOC, monitoring and detection. So this is where the SOC team is going to monitor network and system logs or endpoint devices, security alerts, and other sources of data to identify potential security incidents and threats in real time. So we're going to use tools that we have available to us like our SIM platform, our IDS systems, our threat intelligence feeds, or even manual log analysis. And next we have incident response. So when a security incident is detected, the SOC is going to initiate an incident response or an IR process to investigate, contain, and mitigate the threat. So this is going to involve actually analyzing the incident and gathering evidence, and coordinating with relevant stakeholders to minimize the impact and restore normal business operations. And depending on the size of the SOC, you might have forensic analysis functions as well. This could be something that's conducted in-house, or maybe coordinated with a third party that specifically does forensic examinations. But overall, this is going to include conducting detailed forensic analysis to determine the cause and extent of any security breaches. This is also going to include preserving and collecting digital evidence for any potential legal or regulatory purposes. And depending on the size and severity of the incident, the team may have to collaborate with law enforcement agencies or external forensic experts as necessary. And lastly, here we have malware analysis. And again, depending on the size of your SOC, this is something that could be conducted in-house or coordinated with a third party. And this could involve running malware samples in controlled environments like sandboxes or VMs to understand their actions and potential impact on your systems or networks. It could also involve things like reverse engineering and deobfuscating malware to study its behavior. But the goal here is ultimately to collect indicators of compromise and attempt to attribute the malware to a specific threat actor or group to enhance your threat detection within the organization and inform more proactive defense measures. And speaking of which, we have proactive functions as well. And these are the functions that the SOC performs to prevent cybersecurity incidents before they occur or to mitigate potential vulnerabilities. So we have threat intelligence, and this is where the SOC team actively gathers and analyzes threat intelligence data, either from internal or external sources, so they can stay informed about emerging threats or indicators of compromise, vulnerabilities, as well as other attack techniques. And of course, the goal here is to feed that intelligence into our detection tools themselves so we can then enhance our detection capabilities and find incidents sooner. Which kind of leads us into threat hunting. So this is where the SOC team is going to proactively search for signs of malicious activity or intrusions that might have evaded traditional security controls or detection mechanisms. So by performing specific hunts and analyzing logs and doing detailed searches, we attempt to identify indicators of compromise and potential threats that might be lurking within our environment that we haven't detected yet. And next we have vulnerability management, and some might argue that this could be under reactive or maybe a blend between reactive and proactive, and I wouldn't disagree, because while it does involve reactively responding to vulnerabilities that are identified, it does so in a more proactive way to mitigate them and remediate them before they're exploited. But essentially, vulnerability management is when the team works closely with other departments like the IT team or the development team to identify and address vulnerabilities within the organization's assets. So this is going to involve performing vulnerability scans and assessments, and identifying actual vulnerabilities, and implementing things like patch management schedules, and ensuring that the organization can remediate identified vulnerabilities in a timely manner. And lastly, here we have security awareness training. So the SOC personnel themselves often play a role in promoting cybersecurity awareness within the organization. So they might do things like educate employees on best practices, or write up security policies and procedures and make sure that employees read them, or even provide training to enhance the overall security awareness and help prevent security incidents in the future. They might even go as far as to simulate phishing attacks and gauge how effective the organization is in responding to them or falling victim to them. But ultimately, the end goal here is to mitigate human error that often leads to incidents.